You're listening to the Cycling Podcast in association with Rapha, celebrating the sport and producing the finest cycling clothing since 2004.
Hello, my name's Richard Moore. I'm with Lionel Burney.
Hello, Richard.
And Daniel Freeb.
Where are we, Lionel, Richie? Where are we?
Well, where are we, Lionel?
We're at the rural headquarters of the Cycling Podcast, as opposed to the London headquarters.
Not London. We're in not London. And Daniel, you're back from the desert.
Yep, I'm back in my
Still
gaff.
brushing sand out your clothes, are you?
Yeah, I've been ill actually for the last 24 hours. I've been in bed for most of the last
Again?
24 hours. Yeah,
You're always ill.
I don't know what's going
You
on.
need to
Anyway,
look at your immune system. Anyway, let's just get on with this, shall
It
we?
was probably the rain, wasn't it, in the desert?
Oh yeah, there was
it
rain.
was
Caught you
5
out.
days.
Yeah.
5 days a year of rain on average in Abu Dhabi, and we got 3 of them.
Oh dear, I
Not
feel
great.
terribly sorry for you.
They obviously knew you and your hair was coming.
Anyway, let's get on with this with the traditional news roundup. Lionel, over to you.
Okay, lots of racing to update on. The season proper has started with the first Belgian Classics. The Omloop Het Nieuwsblad was on Saturday, won for the second year in a row by Greg Van Avermaet. A real power trio got away with around 30 odd kilometres to go. And Van Avermaet was the quickest in the sprint in Ghent, beating Peter Sagan, the world champion, and Sepp van Marke of Cannondale Drapac. A little bit of controversy over the riders using bike lanes and pavements instead of the cobbles. We may talk about that in the first part of today's podcast. The second race in Belgium on Sunday, Kuurne, Brussels-Kuurne, was won by Sagan, an impressive sprint finish after Quick Step Floors. Matteo Trentin cocked up the finish with a really bizarrely timed attack into the corner. Not seen that in the Wilfred Peters tactical manual, but that's a bit of a Peters special. Last year's winner Jasper Stuyven was second, and Sky's Luke Rowe was third. The women's Omloop was won by Dutch rider Lucinda Brand, ahead of 3 of her compatriots. And on Sunday, the Omloop Van Het Hageland came down to a sprint finish, won by Jolien D'Or, the Belgian rider, ahead of Australia's Chloe Hosking. A little bit of bad news for the women's peloton, though. The week-long Route de France stage race has been cancelled this year. As I mentioned, Daniel was in the desert. The Abu Dhabi Tour kicked off with a couple of sprint stages, won by the heavyweights Mark Cavendish and Marcel Kittel. The former world champion Rui Costa, riding for the home team, UAE Team Emirates, won the big mountain stage, and that laid the groundwork for his overall victory. Caleb Ewan won the final stage on a very rare rainy day at the Yas Marina motor racing circuit. Blast from the past at the Portuguese race, the Volta ao Alentejo, where former Tour de France yellow jersey Ronaldo Nocentini won a stage. He's 39 years old, and the reason this leapt out to me was because I remember he led the Tour for about a week in 2009. In another race in France, the Tour La Provence, Rowan Dennis of BMC Racing won there. Harlinson Pantano won the Colombian Time Trial Championships, and Sky's Sergio Henao beat Pantano in the road race, so they'll be wearing their national champions jerseys from now on. Off the bike, the Tour de France next year will start on the Passage du Gois in West France, as it did in 2011. That's the causeway that goes into the sea. Quite dramatic start, isn't it? Very, very nice there. 3 very brief bits of news to wrap up. There's been some controversy over disc brakes. We may get around to discussing this. It's a bit of a story that's going nowhere, really. You know, some riders are very anti-disc brakes, some riders are very pro. But this all came out because Sky rider Owain Doull...
Hang on.
Owain Doull. Owain.
Very harsh. I felt that was a decent stab.
Owain Doull.
Owain Doull. Well. Anyway, he posted a picture on social media claiming that a cut in his shoe had been caused by Marcel Kittel's disc brake. I mean, you're gonna need to get deep into the forensics to prove one way or the other what caused that.
The internet was undecided, wasn't it?
Well, some people thought it was definitely a disc brake. Some people thought it was definitely a rusty-looking barrier on the side of the road. But as there's no jury, we don't know what to think. We're no further forwards. But one man who's very much in favour of disc brakes is Tom Boonen. Because his career is coming to the end, and he's the face of Specialized. So no ulterior motive for him riding. Well, I have to say, a very nice looking Specialized at Het Nieuwsblad at the weekend, all white and gold with disc brakes. Lance Armstrong's court date has been scheduled for November. This case is alleging that Armstrong and Tailwind
Cheated.
Sports...
Is that the controversial? Is that the controversial Lance Armstrong? House
Certainly
style,
is.
Lionel.
It could be very costly for Lance Armstrong because he's accused of defrauding the US Postal Service by violating anti-doping clauses in the sponsorship contract. This, if it goes really badly for Armstrong, it could end up costing him and Tailwind Sports close to $100 million. And finally, while we're on controversial subjects, Dr. Richard Freeman was due to appear before the Culture, Media and Sports hearing into doping in sport today, but he pulled out saying he was unill.
Unill.
He was unill.
Yeah, if he was unill, he should be there.
Unfortunately, no, he was ill. Just before you remind me, Rich, Corrections Corner from last week, I said that Ian Stannard had won Kerner Brussels Kerner a few years ago. He was actually third behind Bobby Traxel. I was mixing up my opening Belgian Classics.
Was there not another Kerner Brussels Kern that where he was away and Edvald Bosenhagen was away when they were riding for Sky and it was very wet?
This was a very wet, cold. I had in my mind a very wet, cold edition. The point I was trying to make was that Stannard tends to go well when the conditions are terrible. But
I should have picked you up on that. I'm sorry about that.
No.
But anyway,
it was last week's fake news.
A meaty news roundup there. Hang on. Have you mentioned Abu Dhabi? Yeah, you mentioned Rui Costa scored a surprise home win for the UAE team.
What are you saying?
We'll get onto that in part 2. Daniel can report back from Abu Dhabi.
Before we carry on with the show, this episode was recorded before Simon Cope and Nicole Sapstead appeared at the Department for Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee hearing into doping in sport. We will have a full discussion of what happened and the implications for Team Sky, British Cycling and Bradley Wiggins in next week's episode.
But let's talk about Belgium first, shall we? And Het Nieuwsblad and Kerner Brussels Kern in particular. Het Nieuwsblad, well, both were great races, weren't they? As you said, a lot of, not controversy, but a lot of people wondering whether Van Mark had played the right hand, leaving it to the sprint, and a very memorable bit of TV footage afterwards when Sagan confronted him, asking him why he hadn't attacked. And Van Mark seemed to hint that there was an agreement that they would leave it to the sprint. I mean, there was a moment in that race where it looked like the chasers were going to catch them. The gap was down to about 30 seconds. A lot of very good riders left behind. I suspect not enough domestiques in the group behind. There were a lot of sort of chiefs there and maybe not enough Indians to bring it back. People maybe not fully committed to the chase. But there was a moment in the race where the three guys in front had to fully commit. And I wonder if in that moment an agreement was reached, or Van Mark understood that an agreement was reached that it would leave it to the sprint.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to Jonathan Waters on the Sunday morning, and I'd sat in on the Cannondale Drapac team briefing on the Friday night, and Andreas Clear, the sports director, had kind of run through the plan for the day, which was, as you'd expect, to try and keep Sepp van Marken and Dylan van Baarle, out of any kind of trouble early in the race and try and be there at the moment when the decisions were made. And they did exactly that. Van Marken got into, that was a real A-list group of three, went quite a long way from the finish, and they worked very well together. And so it's understandable that they would cooperate until they knew they had the podium places in the bag. And I think if you make that agreement but then attack, go against that agreement, you've got to look at these races. It's not just a one day. If you basically show yourself to be, untrustworthy in those situations, and you then come to need a bit of cooperation, bit of collaboration in the Tour of Flanders, say, you don't want to have damaged your reputation as somebody who can't be trusted and relied on. And so if they did have an agreement not to, mess about, and to leave it to the sprint, then, that's kind of understandable. But when I spoke to Jonathan Waters on the Sunday, he was pretty happy with how the race had turned out.
Everyone did, exactly what he wanted to do. In the end, it broke down, well, you saw the final into a group of three, and Sepp was there, the plan was executed on perfectly. Sepp had pneumonia in the first couple weeks of January, so his training got pulled back pretty considerably by that. So, I think the level he was at was already hugely encouraging. Considering that he had a fair bit off the bike. Right in the middle of a pretty important training period.
And in terms of the finish, I mean, what was your thoughts on it from a tactical point of view? Because, watching it, you would think that of the three, Sepp is the one who has to try something rather than wait for the sprint.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you see, he's opening the sprint at, like 260 or whatever, and maybe that was just a moment too late. Like maybe, something around 400 and trying to catch the other two off guard, might have been better. But I mean, you know what I mean? You can never really say exactly. I mean, when Sagan sort of swung wide, both of them lost momentum. They kind of choked up into one another, and they both hesitated as a result of that. And that's, Navermaet kept his momentum, and that was it. Yesterday, I think, was different than any other edition that we've seen of Het Nieuwsblad because it's a World Tour race now, and you just had a greater depth of the field, and so it normally in the past, Het Nieuwsblad sort of split apart a little bit more definitively earlier, and then that's it. Like, and the guys behind just sort of, chugged away to the finish line and don't really worry about it because it's only a continental level race and da-da-da. This time around, you could see that groups kept fighting their way back and fighting their way back and fighting their way back. And, it's because there was more depth to the field and it was a World Tour race. I mean, it's essentially, same level peloton that'll be at Flanders and Roubaix and so on and so forth. So, the dynamic of it was different than it's been in past years. I mean, in the past, you've had guys like Cancellara, just skipping out on Het Nieuwsblad weekend, at all. And this year, you didn't see that. There weren't really any of the, the top classics contenders were all at the race.
And just lastly on Peter Sagan, I mean, he's an irrepressible character, isn't he? I mean, I don't know whether you saw his TV interviews afterwards. I mean, he's really got everyone stumped, hasn't he?
I think it's hilarious. I don't know if he's stumped. I think it's just, I mean, he definitely, journalists beware. Like, if you ask him a silly question, you're going to get a silly answer.
So if you were in a journalist position, what would you have asked him after yesterday's race?
I don't know. It's tricky because he clearly, I don't want to say he didn't want to be there, but he was clearly in a bit of an odd mood. So I think it's, I don't know. I wouldn't have wanted to be a journalist tasked with asking him questions yesterday.
And just lastly on your team and how things are moving on. I mean, in terms of the classics, I mean, how do you sort of put together a plan for those races? I mean, presumably you just want your best guys to be as good as possible on as many of those days as possible, and hope for the plan to work out and for the all important ingredient, luck, to land in your lap as well.
Yeah, I mean, we'll need some luck, but we also need, we need to get a few more guys into the picture, for the last hour of the race. Because the only way we'll win one of these is if we have numbers. Yesterday was short and explosive, and you really did sort of have to concentrate on one guy, and really keeping that one guy positioned correctly throughout the race. But, and where it's a little bit longer and draggier in Flanders and Roubaix and whatnot, I think we'll have to figure out a way to have numbers, because having numbers it's historically the way this organization has won races, and I think that's pretty much what we'll have to rely on going forward in the Classic season too.
And just changing tack a little bit, can you give me an update on Taylor Phinney and what's the situation with him? I know he put out that he tweaked his knee and missed the race yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, he just hyperextended it, basically falling out of the bus, which is, an unfortunate way to re-injure a knee. But, it's getting better day by day. The swelling's going down. But, he's going to need another 3 or 4 more days of just easy riding before he's going to be able to, put pressure on it again.
Yeah, Jonathan Vaughters making the point there that the crashes in the race did affect their ability to have numbers up at the front. Cannondale were by no means the only team to lose riders out as a result of those crashes. I mean, Tom Bonen had to eventually pulled out of the race after one of the earlier crashes, and this is one of the big kind of conundrums of classics racing, isn't it? Everybody wants to have numbers in the final so that you've got bodies, and the morale boost of looking round and seeing riders in the same uniform must be tremendous when you're getting down to the last sort of 30-40 kilometres of a race where the margins are so fine. I mean, that move that went away, it almost imperceptible really. It just happened, and then before you know it, you've got arguably the three best riders in the race 30, 40, 50 seconds off the front.
Yeah, and as you say, Lionel, that group did sort of just clip off the front. Trek Segafredo were the big losers there, I think, because they did have bodies up there, and they should have probably had someone in the move. Easier said than done. I thought Greg Van Avermaet rode a very smart race, very shrewd race. Just watching it, you don't know exactly what's going on from watching it, but it looked to me like he was being quite conservative in his efforts early on in that move, and really committed to it later on when the gap came down to about 30 seconds and it needed all three to really pull hard. Sepp Van Mark's very good in these moments, and he's caused real damage in that race before with these accelerations. His Achilles heel is the finish, obviously. So it looked like it was going to come down to between Van Mark and Sagan at the finish. I thought watching it that Cannondale Drapac would be extremely happy to have somebody on the podium in a race like that.
Well, especially as Jonathan said earlier, Van Marke was ill in January. The real objectives are later on in the spring. I mean, they would trade a Tour of Flanders for an Omloop Het Nieuwsblad, clearly. Obviously, that's not the sort of thing you can just choose one or the other and pick one, or we'll win that one then. But when it came into the finish, I mean, obviously watching it, Van Marke's moment was to try something before or on the lower slopes of that hill. But the interesting thing from sitting in on the Cannondale team briefing on the Friday night was Clear was making the point about that kind of snaking S-bend finish up the hill into the Citadel Park in Ghent. And actually, as we saw from last year, it is possible to really iron out that curve in the road if you take the line and just go like an arrow through the middle and really eliminate the curves. But as they started the corner, Sagan actually pushed everybody a bit wide, didn't he? And he certainly made
almost
Van
like he didn't know the road was going around to the right.
Exactly, and he kind of pushed Van Marke up onto the other side of the road, onto the barrier on the left, and gave Van Marke the long way round. And Van Avermaet had the perfect line up the middle. And it was it wasn't that Cannondale didn't know that was how the finish was going to be, because they'd been told, but it was a curious one from Sagan to make that move, really.
Yeah, Sagan, reduced Van Mark's chances even further, but
he got it absolutely. Sagan got it absolutely spot on Sunday at Kuurne Brussels Kuurne.
Sagan, I mean, he's just picked up where he left off, hasn't he? He's just so unbelievably consistent, and it looks easy to me. It looks like he's just having fun most of the time.
Yeah, exactly, Rich. And what impresses me most about Sagan is that he's a guy who has earned a lot of money. He obviously is very famous now in professional cycling. Will have a lot of commitments and go to a lot of prize giving ceremonies and so forth in the winter. And he's also someone whose physiology, I would say, lends itself to putting on weight. I mean, he's quite a robust fellow, much like you, Lionel, in fact. And you had all those ingredients.
Very similar.
Well, you add all those ingredients together, and actually, Mark Cavendish is another one like this. Puts on weight pretty easily, and you think that's a kind of recipe. All those ingredients are a recipe for someone to really come into a season at some point in their career really undercooked, and to really struggle for a couple of months of the season, and to really get into a negative spiral, whether it's because they've rested on their laurels from the previous season or another reason. And Sagan has never done that at any point really in his career, and I think that's very impressive. And again, even tweaking things, changing things slightly in the way he's prepared for races and trained. I mean, I think this year is the first time that he's spent 10 days or so before the start of the classic season at altitude. He's been at the Sierra Nevada, and that's exactly the kind of thing that has caused problems with other riders' preparation, other riders' performances. Sepp van Mark's a good example of someone who has really played around and tried various different things to just time his form peak just right for the classics, and it hasn't worked a lot of the time. I mean, he's found form too quickly. It happened a couple of years that he was in great form in Omloop Het Nieuwsblad and then really struggled in the Tour of Flanders, and then he tried to switch that, and then he struggled in the early part of the season and then never found his best form. But Sagan seems to be able to do anything, and he still maintains that very high level of performance.
You really had my interest there with talk of ingredients and recipes,
and
but then lost it a bit with undercooked. I like things to be properly cooked. But what did you make of Matteo Trentin's unusual attack? I mean, going into that 90-degree left-hand corner, gave him basically used all of his sprint effort, attacking into the corner, slowing down, losing momentum through the corner, and then not really having enough to lift it again.
Well, it wouldn't be the opening weekend of the Belgian Classic season without a complete cock-up by Quickstep, would it? With probably with Wilfried Peters behind the wheel of the first team car. Bless him. But I mean, it's interesting that Trentin's been. Well, I suppose that this process started a couple of years ago, but he's gradually being sort of promoted through the ranks, and now he's one of the key players. Having been a domestique, he's one of the key players in the Quickstep Classics arsenal. He's a very quick rider. He's a very versatile rider. But it'll be interesting to see how he dovetails with the likes of Nicky Terpstra in the Classics, because obviously they're under an awful lot of pressure with Boonen retiring. Paris-Roubaix.
A great opportunity for him though, Trentin, wasn't it? With so many of the sprinters who might have otherwise been at Kuurne Brussels Kuurne racing in Abu Dhabi, and to get himself into that group was good. And you would have expected him to do a little better than he did, but there we are. Maybe
Sagan though, when he went totally decisive, it was about 300 metres, wasn't it? He went pretty early, but very, very decisive. And you mentioned, Daniel, earlier that he's never had that difficult season. I guess there was a period when he went a long time without a win, wasn't there? A couple of years ago, but he never lost his focus. He kept trying. He didn't seem to affect him too much. He didn't become overly. He didn't start overthinking things. In particular, it seemed to me that he's very much. We've spoken about this before. Somebody who seems to live in the moment. And races on instinct, and it didn't seem to affect him. He even spoke about all his second and third places in positive terms, which, when you see all the criticism of Sepp van Mark for not doing more to try and win at Het Nieuwsblad, you do think, well, hang on, podium at Het Nieuwsblad is a good result for him and for his team in particular.
Yeah, just lastly on Sagan, I mean, he was asked, wasn't he, why didn't you win? And that's always going to be the question when he does finish second or third. But it should be a reminder to everyone, really, that even if you're as talented as Sagan and as capable in so many different scenarios as he is, and back-to-back world champion and a rider who you really could put down as a potential winner for every classic from Milan-San Remo through to Amstel Gold if he chose to, he can't win every day. There will be days when either the tactic don't work out or the legs just aren't quite strong enough, and so that's what keeps us watching, isn't it? It'd be very easy to say, well, there's the nailed on victor for the Tour of Flanders, but we know come early April we won't be able to just sort of guarantee who the winner's going to be on the day.
The Cycling Podcast is supported by Science in Sport. Science in Sport. Fueled by science.
Thank you very much to Science and Sport, who sponsor the Cycling Podcast throughout 2017. A reminder that you can get 20% off all your Science and Sport products at scienceandsport.com. Enter the code TCP20 for a whole 20% off. one or two of you have got in touch to say you've had problems with that code, but we've checked it out and it's fine. It's working okay. So if you do have a problem, do let us know and we will follow up on that. But it is working. So I don't know what I'm saying there.
Well, and also if you've forgotten what the code is, you've just got to listen back to the episode again. You can't just ask us on Twitter, oh, hey, what's the code?
Yeah, just rewind. Anyway, get your 20% off your science and sport products. We'll be doing some other things with science and sport. Sorry, Lionel, I just kicked a chair. We'll be doing some other things with science and sport coming up, telling you a little bit more about what they do and about sports nutrition. Got some features coming up on that throughout the year.
I need to get an order in as well before the Lionel of Flanders at the end of March.
You're going to need a lot of science and sport product.
I'm going to need to keep very well fed.
Fueled is the term I think we use.
Yep.
I think one might argue, Lionel, based on your picture of what you ate on Pancake Day, you're too well fed at this current moment in time. Anyway.
Yeah, maybe no science and sport products for you, Lionel. Just wing it. You'll be fine. Anyway, let's turn our attention to the desert, Abu Dhabi. You were out there, Daniel, moonlighting for another employer. We did catch the odd glimpse of you, or rather heard you on our telly boxes from time to time. What have you been out to one of these desert races before? I mean, I think Lionel and I have been to Qatar, Oman. Have you been out to the Middle Eastern races before?
I have not.
So
I've given them a wide berth.
What were your impressions?
Well, I think the amazing thing about Abu Dhabi was the field, and I think we mentioned that last week, that there is an agreement between RCS and Velon which dictates that every Velon affiliated team sends a star rider of sorts to the RCS races. And so there were, fantastic field of sprinters, fantastic field of stage racers. The racing itself, to be honest, was not particularly great at all. The terrain there obviously limits the kind of racing you can have, because there are basically two types of terrain. One is pan flat, and then the other one in one particular corner of that emirate, Abu Dhabi. There are some mountains. And so we had three very flat stages, which ended in bunch sprints, and then one mountaintop finish at Jebel Hafit, which is quite a spectacular location. It was where he took the red jersey and effectively tied up the general classification. The sprint battles were very interesting. It was really interesting to see Caleb Ewan really announce his arrival in the big league of sprinters. We have obviously seen him dominate sprints at the Tour Down Under and really beat lesser opposition, dominate lesser opposition at various points over the past season or so. But we've not really seen him go head-to-head against the big beasts of the sprinting world, the Cavendishes, the Greipels, the Lionel's Cat. And we've not seen him go up against Lionel's Cat either, or Marcel Kittel. And I think, there was the second stage that finished at Al Marina. He really proved that he is at home in that company. He should have won there, but celebrated too early and was beaten by Marcel Kittel. And then on the last day on the Formula One circuit at Yas Marina, he won by a good margin, and thereby proved that he's going to be a force to be reckoned with. I think in Grand Tours as well against those guys.
Just to be positive on the Abu Dhabi Tour, there is the possibility that if everything, if the Tour Qatar hadn't been cancelled this year, there really is a sort of, we keep talking about this idea of having a season where there's sort of a logical, themes to the season. You could have back-to-back stage races in the Gulf, and then you'd start to, build a part of the season that could stand in its own right. But it has to be said, and I'm not being overly critical, it has to be said that this race last week proves that just having a great field of all the best riders in the world does not make a compelling sporting spectacle at all, because there was very little else to really recommend it. I mean, being hypercritical about the mountain stage, it was kind of like almost a sort of training mountain race, really, wasn't it? It wasn't there wasn't a sense that this is really anyone laying down a marker for later in the season. Romain Bardet had a pretty poor day, but in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter. We didn't learn too much about the form and fitness of any of those riders, and unfortunately, if I'm to be really harsh, it's an event that doesn't matter. It doesn't carry any weight whatsoever. There's no history. There's no sense of.
It carries World Tour points.
Yeah, but World Tour points. Who really is interested in them other than the teams and the riders? I mean, it doesn't make a. I mean, we could talk about the impact of World Tour points on Het Nieuwsblad, for example, and as Jonathan Vaughters said, it isn't the fact that there are points on offer. It's just the fact that it brings all the strongest riders. The Het Nieuwsblad field was probably stronger this year than it has been at any point in the race's history, because there were fewer of the wildcard type teams. All of the top teams were there. We had all of the top teams in Abu Dhabi. We had a stellar field. I mean, the top sort of 15, 18 riders on the mountain stage would look like a Tour de France stage finish on paper. And yet there's something missing, isn't there? Well,
people, for one thing. I mean, having the contrast of the opening weekend in Belgium, then changing channel, or not changing channel, but the Abu Dhabi tour coming on afterwards on Eurosport really threw that into stark relief, the contrast between the two. And you've got interesting terrain, you've got history, you've got fans more than anything. And I thought the final stage in Abu Dhabi, the motor racing circuit, you can see the thinking behind it, that this would be a great location, a great backdrop. Terrible, empty stands, nobody there. A terrible advert for the sport, really terrible advert for the sport. It's like a football match played behind closed doors, and when you see football matches played in front of no fans, it loses all of the kind of the magic that a live game in front of a big crowd has. And it's the same with cycling. You need fans there. You need the atmosphere that they create.
And not to forget as well that a motor racing circuit is not made for cycling. It was too wide. I mean, one of the great things about racing is that there's pressure to be at the front. On that motor racing circuit, pretty much anyone could have been at the front if they wanted. They were 12, 15 abreast at points, and there was room for more. And when you watch Het Nieuwsblad and you have the helicopter shots, there are times when it looks like, if you remember the old game Snake on the Nokia, the peloton weaving its way left to right all the way through. You get the perspective of one group on the road and another group on the road. Visually exciting, visually interesting, and that's a real challenge. Particularly when even the mountain stage is on it looks too nice, doesn't it? The surface is too good. It all looks. It doesn't look gritty and gnarly, and that's kind of what the visual appeal of cycling is.
Well, it just underlines, Lionel, that cycling, and we've said this many times before, is a rich palette of different ingredients, and one of the ingredients undoubtedly is the context, is the backdrop, is the course, and and what Abu Dhabi can offer at the moment is one, money. Two, enthusiasm on the part of a few people, and it can offer the kind of terrain for good sprint stages. And there's one mountain stage at the moment. There is one other mountain that I understand they could conceivably take the race up in future, and they will probably try to do that. They'll probably extend the race, or try to extend the race to 5 days in future. So there might be 2 mountain stages, and there might also be a time trial thrown in. But beyond that, I mean, I can sort of sympathise with and agree with a lot of your points. I mean, the one thing that I would like to see in these golf races, I don't even know if it's possible, to be honest, but just looking around in Abu Dhabi and the kind of roads that they have available to them, they're generally sort of 2-lane, 3-lane highways, not a terribly densely populated place, so there tend to be big highways between cities or towns, but you do see these little tracks going off, these little kind of dirt tracks going off on either side of the road, and I just wondered whether a good way to show off the unique landscape that you have there would be some sections of what we call white road or strade bianche, and I think that might be feasible, and I think that would really add an extra dimension to those races, and also introduce the possibility of even going uphill every now and again, and downhill, up and down the dunes.
King
Well,
of the
I
sand
have
dunes.
another idea to add a different dimension, but it overlaps with our topic for the third part, so I will save it.
Let's move on to that.
Whoever you are, whatever you ride, whatever the reason, Rafa exists to improve your ride with the finest kit, inspiring stories, and vibrant clubhouses and communities all over the world.
Thank you very much indeed to our main sponsor, Rafa. Thank you, Rafa. Very grateful indeed to them for their continuing support. Now, as you talked there, Daniel, about the riders veering off the roads and into the desert, it occurred to me that we didn't discuss riders veering off the cobbles and onto the cycle paths in part one.
We didn't know. Quick word on that?
I mean, the thing about it is that you're not allowed to do it. Riders do it. If you don't penalise them for doing it, they're going to carry on doing it. It's like in rugby, if a player talks back to the referee, he gets punished. In football, he doesn't. So they don't do it in rugby, and they do it in football. It's really easy. Enforce the penalties.
There are many things like that in cycling, aren't there, Rich? Drafting behind cars.
Yeah. I mean, there were a few comments about sticky bottles, particularly from Quick Step at the weekend. And yeah, I completely agree. And on Saturday, there was a moment really when it did seem like one group on the road was being told to stick to the cobbles, and the next group on the road was basically just going on to the cycle path. And so if the same rules aren't in place for all the riders, then it's a mess. The only way to avoid it is to put some hay bales in the cycle lanes. If that's where you don't want the riders to go, just hay bales down. I know it's infrastructure that would have to be done the day before the race or on the morning of the race or what have you, but that's one solution. If you really don't want the riders to ride on a certain part of the landscape, then put something in their way.
I like it. I quite like it when they hair along the cycle paths.
Yeah.
Luke Rowe was sort of disapproving at one point, I think, on Sunday's race, where he was sort of a one-man protest against.
Oh, he stayed on the cobbles
paths,
so long it cost him probably another 8 watts.
Highly ironic, of course, isn't it? Highly ironic that in a bike race you're not allowed to use cycle lanes. But anyway,
very true.
Yeah. So listen. Part 3, we're going to talk about this new Velon race. Now, should explain what it is. It's been announced officially today, although Daniel, you spoke to Graham Bartlett, the chief executive at Velon, last week, and we'll hear from him in a moment. But it's a new event. It'll be in Limburg, and this maybe ties in with the conversation we had in the last part, where we can at least sort of welcome the fact that it's happening in a place with an established following for cycling, so you would imagine that the crowds could be pretty good. It's happening in, I think, September, isn't it? September?
No, June.
June, no?
June.
Oh, sorry.
First weekend in June. It's going to coincide with the first weekend of the Dauphiné.
Anyway, I'll go through what the format is, because I've got the 3-day race program here. Day 1, Hammer Sprint, 2 hours of blistering entertainment, they promise. Each team's chosen 5 riders take on 10 laps of approximately 10 kilometres each. Points awarded for the top 10 riders across the line at the end of each lap. Double points may be awarded in certain laps. So it's like a points race on the road. Should point out it's a team event. The whole focus of the race is on the teams. Day 2, Hammer Climb.
Stop! Hammer time!
I don't.
What was that? Have they got to wear big baggy trousers
Hammer
as well,
Climb.
or instead of lycra bib short?
Hammer Climb, a 2-hour pain fest that you can't keep your eyes off. 2 hours is quite a long time to not be able to keep your eyes off something. That's optimistic, I think. I'm reading the press release here. Each team's chosen 5 riders take on a multi-lap challenge of a course specially designed with a punishing hilltop finish line. Total elevation, average and maximum gradients and climb lengths will vary from race to race, but all will test the world's strongest climbing teams. Points awarded for the top 10 riders across the line at the end of each lap. Same point structure as a Hammer Sprint. Again, double points on some laps. So again, a points race, but with a climb this time. Day 3, Hammer Chase. The team chase, a Fox and Hounds team pursuit on time trial bikes. Each team chooses 5 riders for the 50-kilometre circuit team time trial, with their 4th place finisher's front wheel the piece of carbon fibre to keep your eyes on! ! Teams set off with a staggered start. The leading team after the first 2 days goes off first. The second place team sit for an agonising 30 seconds and watch them disappear into the distance. And then the gun goes off. You're following this. Then they go. Fourth team feel the adrenaline surging for 20 more seconds.
I quite like this whole concept, and I've been quite favourable toward it. But now
You're very
hearing you read the press release, my opinion's changing. Anyway,
I mean,
go on.
The Buffalo has butchered the concept, hasn't
it? It's a team time trial.
It's a handicap.
It's
It's a handicap team time trial, isn't
Yeah.
it? And the first team across the line. The idea is that on the last day, every team could still win the event. And I mean, that's the most interesting aspect of this.
You've been very enthusiastic about it.
Well,
Daniel.
yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to pick you up on that, Daniel, because when I suggested a few of these wacky races type
you're
ideas
missing
for
the
our
point.
2020
I already know you're
special
missing the point.
episode at the end of last year, you mocked. You shut me down
you're missing
and
the
mocked.
point. The
I'd
reason,
just like to remind you of that.
the reason I'm very much in favour of this is that it chimes with, remember, something that I was banging the drum about in the winter when we were talking about the future of cycling and 2020 vision and so forth. That was having more focus on teams in cycling. And I think the unique, the interesting, the novel thing about this event is that it is a team event, and as I say, the first team across the line on the Sunday is going to be the winning team, and I think that is a good thing for a number of reasons that I'll go into, Richard, after we hear from... Should we hear from Graham Bartlett? Graham, an exciting day or exciting couple of days for Velon. You've announced a new race series, a new race that's going to take place in Limburg in June, something that cycling hasn't seen before, the format that you're unveiling. But first of all, this series, the Hammer series, just explain a little bit, briefly if possible, because I know it's pretty complicated, exactly what it is.
It's very simple, actually, Dan. We're really excited to announce it. It's been a fantastic day with Limburg yesterday. We've done some really good stuff with them. Really happy to be there. The Hammer series and Hammer racing, it's all about team v team. Only a team can win the race. You get 3 days of intensive riding. The first day they sprint against each other. The next day it's climbing. The last day is the chase. Leaders from the first 2 days go off first, and then they chase each other as teams. And then the first team over the line wins. So it's very simple.
Well, you've actually shocked me, because it's a kind of newfangled, what we cynics, particularly on the podcast, would call a newfangled, gimmicky concept that actually sounds very, very appealing. And it actually tallies with a sort of idea I had, and I've been banging a drum about all winter, which was that there should be more focus on teams in professional cycling, particularly the biggest races like the Giro d'Italia and the Tour de France.
Absolutely, we completely agree with that. Cycling is a wonderful team sport, and yet the races themselves seldom celebrate that aspect. We want to really bring that to the fore, showing how teams fight against each other, how they combine and ride for each other as riders. It's a wonderful aspect of the sport, and it needs more focus, and this is what this type of racing does. It's all about the team versus the team.
And the format, the race itself, is based around the idea of constant action, really. So there are going to be sprints and there are going to be points throughout the race. For a sprint stage, for example, or the first day, you're not going to have to wait 3 hours until a sprint finish. How did you come up with this format, Graham? I mean, what kind of people were involved, and what was the process that led to this format?
It started with the teams themselves. I mean, the greatest expertise in racing is with the teams. It started with the teams and the riders. How could we create what you just described there, impact racing, so that we see sprints, you see 10 sprints in a day, you see them over 10k laps, you see them in one city in one place, so that people can see a lot of the action in one go. The next day, the climbing, the ability to see these guys perform on a repeat basis in action all the time over those 2 hours. So it was the teams and the riders who started with this concept, and they played around with it. Then we took it out to the media. Took it out and consulted with broadcasters and media and said, what would you like? What do you think is right? And then we took it to fan groups and said, look, we're trying to do something different here, but it's very respectful of the disciplines of the race. For me, I don't find it gimmicky at all, because it's highlighting what these guys do on a daily basis. They sprint, they climb, they chase. These are the core disciplines of the sport, and all we're doing is elevating them, condensing them. One of the riders summed it up. I think he said, this is impact racing.
And Velon has become almost synonymous with efforts to improve technology and the viewer experience in cycling. And you've already done a lot on that in the last year or so. But presumably this series allows you to concentrate even more on that and bring in even more new things. Is that right?
We will launch the best new technology developments that we have available in this series. We really want to be able to show the fans inside the race. The riders and the teams have been fantastic in moving towards this, and sometimes at cost to themselves, because we do know that putting anything on a bike or taking anything off a bike is a real imposition. These guys are fine athletes with super highly toned machines they're riding here, so we get that, and we're trying to absolutely minimise the imposition as we bring the technology. But for sure, the fans want to see inside the rope, and we've had the feedback that we've had from releasing this year the rider telemetry data. We started in the Tour de Suisse last year by publishing what these guys were performing, and I remember very well when Fabien Cancellara won stage 1 of the Tour de Suisse last year, when we just launched the system, and you could see his power, his heart rate, his cadence, what he was doing as a high performance athlete. You could see that as he was doing it, and that's hugely exciting for the fans, and it's the trend in all of the sports. Let's put people inside this great sport, get them to understand it better, get them to know it more, and by doing so, love it more.
So that was Graham Bartlett. So yeah, Daniel, very sceptical after listening to your ideas for the future of the sport, Lionel. But having spoken to Graham Bartlett, he's all in favour.
Oh well, yeah, Graham, it's a great idea. The thing is that my description of these wacky race formats.
So we actually did that interview. on a sun-kissed balcony while drinking cocktails. So that perhaps had something to do with it.
Near an airport as well, I think.
But even my garbled explanations of how these wacky race formats could work was more eloquent and understandable than the press release. But I think there needs to be some real left field thinking, and I welcome the idea of having an event that is a completely different format, because there is such great potential, particularly if you're trying to design a season which the key parts of the season are not going to change. It's going to be the classics and the Grand Tours. But having everything else all the same flavour, I think is a missed opportunity. And just to go back to the last part of this podcast, talking about the races in the desert, one way to really join them up is to have a proper desert swing to the season. 4 or 5 weeks of racing, back-to-back stage races with an overall king of the desert or an overall team. I mean, even here, I'm getting a mocking look from Richard. But if you created a series of races where all of the attention is on those races, and then it comes to a close just in time for Het Nieuwsblad and Kuurne Brussels Kuurne to usher in the next wave of races, I think there's potential for this. For this early part of the season to mean a bit more than it currently does, even if that means having a team champion for the desert races. I don't know. But somebody, it's good to see an organisation like Velon mixing it up and trying to come up with a different format. I have no doubt it will be mocked before and possibly during and after. But I think it's important for cycling to re-examine what a lot of these other events, what their place on the calendar should be.
Well, Lionel, I agree with all that, and I think that Velon should be applauded for doing something which is genuinely bold and is a genuine paradigm shift with this focus on the teams. And we talked about the stages in Abu Dhabi, the flat stages, and no one, if you were starting with a blank canvas now, no one would design a sport in which consists of 5 hours of guys trundling along on the flat with a break that has no chance of winning, followed by a bunch sprint. In the modern world, where we all struggle to hold our concentration for 20 seconds, without looking at Twitter or email or whatever. There is no way that you would conceive a sport in that way. And I think the really interesting and the important thing about the shifting the focus towards the teams is, this idea we talked about when we were discussing business models for the sport. And, Jonathan Vaughters spoke to us over the winter about how the teams essentially with the funding model the way it is in cycling, have no capital, have no real assets, have no fixed assets, because there is no guarantee that they can, no very long-term guarantee that they'll be in the Tour de France, for example, or in the Giro d'Italia. But one conceivable potential asset they could have would be a really strong fan base with some kind of longevity. And at the moment, they don't really have that. Individuals are well supported, and the tribalism in cycling tends to be very much directed towards, well, it's nationalities and individuals. Now, if you could find a way to really cultivate people's allegiance to a team, which is something that this series will look to do, then I think that's one thing that will make teams very, very attractive to sponsors, and and is an asset, and is some kind of a really valuable capital in itself.
I think it's wider than that, though, Daniel, isn't it? Because I think it's important that some formats are created that force the teams and riders to think differently. I'm not a big rugby fan, but I did watch a bit of the England-Italy rugby game at the weekend where
Scotland-Wales was the best one, Lionel.
Well, I don't know enough to know whether
Trust
to even
me.
comment on that. But I do know that I'll show up my lack of knowledge of rugby here, but I do know that Italy tried an unusual tactic, and it really sort of spooked England. They didn't know how to get to grips with it in the first half. They basically didn't engage in rucks, did they? Have I got that right? So they basically ripped up the kind of convention of playing a game of rugby, and the England coach came out and said that, basically that wasn't a rugby game we watched. And I was talking to our friend and colleague Brendan Gallagher, who covers a lot of rugby, and he made the point that he'd love to see a Tour de France of complete anarchy, where somebody really does, break with convention, and the Tour isn't just about sort of three riders from the three wildcard teams getting into an early break, riding 6 minutes ahead of the bunch for 3 hours, and then there being a sprint. And I think a race like this, where we'll all know who the best riders are, but it's about using the resources available to try and prevail in what will initially be an unfamiliar format, but over time there's potential that you could introduce sort of tactical aspects that are a bit more varied. You might see some really exciting, really interesting racing, and we might have an awful lot more to talk about.
Well, Lionel, in Abu Dhabi, I had a long conversation with Mauro Vegni, the Giro d'Italia director, and he mentioned the fact that a couple of weeks ago he had a meeting with Christian Prudhomme, in which Christian Prudhomme, of course, the director of the Tour de France, and they are really racking their brains at the moment about a way to shake things up and make racing more exciting, because they are fed up. They really are fed up with this model, particularly on flat days, of the break going clear, the break having no chance and then being caught, no counterattacks at any point in the stage. You can set your watch by exactly when the break's going to be caught, and everyone knows what's going to happen. I think at the moment, for various reasons, they just can't quite summon the courage to really impose the change upon the teams with a really radical shift in the rules or the format of the racing. But it could be that this Hammer series, it could be the spur. Once they see something else successful in another context or organised by different people, then that might be the spur for them to actually take the plunge. I mean, I know they mooted the idea and they tried to force through 8-man teams for this year's Grand Tours, and that's not going to happen now. But I think we all probably suspect that it's going to take something much more radical than that. It might be 6-man teams, it might be 5-man teams, or it might be something like more along the lines of this new series.
Well, you've anticipated exactly what I was going to say, Daniel. I struggle when I read the format and try to visualise. I struggle to muster up too much enthusiasm. I'm maybe too traditional in my thinking, but there's a way within the existing stage race format to introduce some different elements. I'm going to get onto that, Lionel. I'm going to get onto that. Give me a chance here. I'm going to, I cannot see myself being all that interested in this weekend's racing, but I applaud the attempt to try something new, and I think, in particular, for what it could do in terms of shaking up ASO and RCS, who are so conservative in their thinking, and we've spoken a bit in the past as well about their attitude towards women's racing and how they haven't done anything at all to engage with that, to promote it. Where you could argue they've got a responsibility to do so, but also that they're missing out on a big opportunity there. And I think we've seen in the past at various times innovations. A mountain stage like there was in the Giro one year, which is just a road stage straight up a mountain.
What?
Or
what do you mean?
Yeah, Andy Hampson won a very short mountain stage in the Giro.
They did one in the Tour as well in 85, didn't they? Yeah.
Did one in 96 as well, didn't they?
Yeah,
but that was for other reasons.
Yeah.
But or a downhill time trial like there was in the Giro in 1987.
But Daniel, you made the point there about ASO and RCS scratching their heads. I mean, ASO in particular have got enough races in their portfolio to take one of the events, say Paris-Nice or the Dauphiné, and tinker with the format there. I mean, one idea that I've always thought would work is if you had a situation where there's opportunities for the other team members to win time bonuses on behalf of their team leader. So, for example, to take BMC, Richie Port's going for the overall, and a sprinter can win intermediate time bonuses that come off Richie Port's overall time. And so you keep the element of a race decided by aggregate time, but you introduce broader team factors into it. And you could widen that out and have kind of, time bonuses on offer at the top of climbs, time bonuses for getting into a break that gets more than 3 minutes or so on and so forth. And, there are ways that without being really radical and without affecting the Tour de France and making a catastrophic mistake, and then in 10 years' time we all look back and go, well, that year's Tour was a complete farce because they tinkered with the rules to such an extent. It's not like ASO haven't got other races where they could try out some different formats. Some may not work, but let's have a go and let's see what they can come up with.
Exactly, Lionel. And they could roll it out in another of their events, but I think again, just to repeat it one last time, I think the real problem, or one real problem that cycling has had, is a failure to really translate the whole team aspect and the team dimension of professional cycling into a language that the lay fan or the first time watcher can understand. I think it's still a slight mystery to a lot of the target, or not the target audience, the potential audience of professional cycling. Exactly what contribution domestiques are making to a leader's race. I sort of advocated more focus on teams and more focus on the team classification in the Tour de France and Giro d'Italia and so forth, knowing that it's probably pie in the sky, and knowing that probably no one would agree with me. But so I was quite pleasantly surprised to see an event being unveiled that did precisely that. Just one last point, Rich. I did speak to a couple of riders about this in Abu Dhabi. One rider, I'm not going to reveal his identity, but I would say he's not quite a Galactico of world stage racing, but a fairly major figure in Grand Tours. I explained the concept of the Hammer Series to him, and the accent might give it away, or it will certainly narrow down who it was, but he said, that sounds like a terrible idea. Anyway.
Well, Daniel, you'll be at the Dauphiné. Richard,
try to work out who that was.
You'll have just
have to
got
do
back
it again.
from...
That wasn't very good. That wasn't a very good impression. I'm usually better than that. Anyway, go on.
Who was that?
Malcolm
Anyway,
Oliver?
go on, carry on.
Can you
crack
not
on,
a Galactico.
chap.
please do send your guesses. You can win you win a Rafa top if you guess correctly who that was.
Wow, that's volunteering
Just
to give.
tweet us or Facebook us.
Well, if Daniel's at the Dauphiné on the weekend of this, what Hammer Time? What's the race called?
Hammer Series. No?
The Hammer Series.
Just finally,
I'm volunteering now to go on behalf of the
Hammer
Cycling
Series.
Podcast.
Okay, great. We should definitely be there. It's
I'll go. I'll be bemused. I'll get to grips with it. I'll explain how it works.
The other thing that we haven't mentioned, Rich, and I'm not sure whether this was in the press release, is that it's going to take place on a custom-built circuit, which in future is going to be used as, or is going to become a kind of bike park that the public will be able to use and ride on. So it's kind of a custom-built sort of cycling stadium.
Look, I can feel my scepticism eroding actually as the discussion goes on. My initial reaction was that I didn't seem to be really anything. It was tinkering too much with what I love about road racing. But I think I remain to be convinced. I'll try and be as open-minded as possible, and there'll be much of interest to see how it goes. And having that buy-in from the teams is important, because it needs the teams to really get behind it, and the riders and the teams to really get behind it for it to work. Just to add, I mentioned that mountain stage. It was actually a 1985 Giro. It was a 36-mile, 58-kilometre mountain stage, but pretty much just straight uphill. From what I can recall, Andy Hampsten won that stage, the first ever Grand Tour ridden by a 7-Eleven team. Anyway, should we wrap things up there?
We certainly should.
I'm off to Paris-Nice. I'll come from... next week's podcast will come from Paris-Nice. I think it'll be myself and Francois Thomazeau. He doesn't know that yet. Francois, if you're listening, you're going to do the podcast with me next week, I hope.
And Daniel and I get a week off.
Great. Well, we'll resume in a couple of weeks. In the meantime, thank you, Lionel.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks, Lionel.
You've been listening to the Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Thank you to Glass Pear for the music in this episode. For more information and to download more editions of the show, visit thecyclingpodcast.com.